Special 2020.
News from Moscow that Soviet President Yuri Andropov has died yesterday afternoon at about 5 o'clock. That announcement from TASS. The Today program coming up following this newscast will also be following this story. Let's check in now with Bryant Gumbel for a preview of what they're planning as they follow this story. Bryant?
Well, good morning, John. We are, of course, going to have much more on the death of Andropov. For openers, we're going to try to gain some historical perspective on his 15 months in office. We are also this morning going to be talking with several experts in Soviet affairs. Maybe they can shed some light on the possibilities of succession and also offer some insight into perhaps what may lie in the days ahead. On another note, we're going to engage in something different this morning. We're going to engage in a bit of role-playing and seat at the bargaining table spokesmen for the U.S., Lebanese, and Israeli points of view. And we'll hear what arguments they voice in pursuit of a peace plan. There's much more ahead for Friday morning on Today, John.
Of a lifetime for a moment of glory. Share the magical moments of the 14th Winter Olympic Games with ABC.
For only about 15 months. Good morning, I'm David Hartman. Joan London is on assignment in Sarajevo. Let's now go right to Peter Jennings with the latest on Andropov's death. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, David, and I must say that you have the headline, and we don't know a great deal other than that. The signs were there for much of the night. 69-year-old Mr. Andropov, we were told, had died, we learned, at about 24 minutes after the past hour. The signs, as I said, had been there last night. There was, in fact, a flurry of activity, some phone calls made to international news agencies, and in Moscow itself last night, there were some partial signs because Soviet programming, jazz programming in one instance, was interrupted and classical music was put on. The KGB lights burned unusually bright, we're told, at night, and so did those lights in the foreign ministry. But it was, while a surprise, not a surprise. Mr. Andropov had not been seen for almost 200 days, 174, I think is the exact figure. He's been very much of a transitory figure. Not the absolute successor to Leonid Brezhnev, who died in November of '82, and we don't know a good deal more at the moment. The first news really came from the French Foreign Ministry in a hard way, and then the Soviets announced it, as I said, just about 35 minutes ago, and we do not know what's going to happen in Moscow next. He was 69 years old, and as I think most people know, he suffered from serious ailments. It is believed that it was a kidney ailment in the final analysis that he succumbed to. We now go to Washington and Steve Bell. Steve?
Thank you, Peter. It was early this morning here on the East Coast, early afternoon in Moscow when the Kremlin made it official. Soviet citizens got the word from official television, and after a lengthy program of somber music, a statement was read also on Moscow radio.
And all the Soviet people that on February the 9th, at 16 hours, 50 minutes, Moscow time, after a prolonged illness, the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, Yuri Andropov, passed away.
After 15 months in office, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov is dead. Walter Rodgers standing by in Moscow with the latest from there. Walt? We appear to have lost our line from Moscow for the moment. Yuri Andropov, of course, had led the Soviet Union for only 15 months, and much of that time was shrouded in secrecy. ABC's Moscow bureau chief Bob Zelnick takes a look back.
Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov. He was 68 years old at the time he succeeded Leonid Brezhnev. He had run the KGB for 15 years, beginning in 1967, and had been a full member of the ruling Politburo since 1973. Yet perhaps because less was known about Andropov than any former Soviet leader at the time he took power, more was expected. Andropov had been ambassador to Hungary in 1956, the year Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest to keep their satellite in orbit. But some predicted he would take an enlightened view of developments in Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe. Members of the Soviet establishment themselves expressed the hope that Andropov could make fundamental corrections in the stagnant Soviet economy, if not in the political system itself. That little of this came to pass during Andropov's brief rule is perhaps not surprising, but that Andropov had managed to create so positive an aura about himself did point to his one significant ability as General Secretary, the ability to present the Soviet perspective on East-West issues in a way that captured the political initiative for the Soviets. According to Western diplomats who met with him, his arguments were expressed with precision and his tone was moderate. But on such matters as Poland, Afghanistan, and even nuclear arms control, his positions were no more flexible than were those of the man he had succeeded. Domestically, too, Andropov's changes seemed more matters of style than substance. The Politburo, for example, used to meet in total secrecy. Under Andropov, meetings were disclosed, short summaries published. For more than 3 years, the Soviets barely mentioned the war in Afghanistan. Under Andropov, newspaper and television accounts of the war became increasingly frequent. Perhaps for political reasons, Andropov seemed more willing than Brezhnev to spend hard Soviet currency bringing more food into the country. Muscovites claimed that the recent supplies of citrus fruit from Morocco, poultry from Hungary, and beef from France were the best in recent years. But on the tough economic questions, Andropov did little or nothing. He came up with no plan for Soviet agriculture, no plan to provide incentives for workers and managers, no plan for getting the entrenched communist bureaucracy off the backs of Soviet trade and industrial leaders. Yuri Andropov was the fifth man to lead the Soviet Union and the fourth to leave office through death. His regime accomplished little, changed little, and he'll probably be regarded as a failure. That judgment may be harsh. What is really failing is the Soviet political system, and not even the enormous size and power of that country can long continue to hide that fact.
Bob Zelnick, what's going to be the interim in the Soviet Union?
After Leonid Brezhnev died, Steve, the Politburo moved very quickly and the Central Committee to name a successor. Now there are more candidates, there are more judgments to be made, but of course they've had 5 or 6 months to think about it. I would suspect that for purposes of continuity, they'll move very rapidly if they can.
And let's go to the State Department now, where Barry Dunsmore is standing by. Barry, what's the Soviet-U.S. relationship likely to be, the U.S. reaction to the passing of Andropov?
Well, Steve, so far there has been no official reaction, and as far as we can make out, the State Department is on a perfectly normal schedule. Senior officials were notified, but none of them hurried in, and things are being looked at rather leisurely. This, of course, is a reflection of the fact that the analysis of the implications of Andropov's death has long since been made, and really there's not too much to do now but wait and see who the successor will be and see what kind of relationship evolves. Certainly under Andropov, the U.S.-Soviet relationship has been very shaky, to put it mildly, and the hope obviously has to be that things will be better. But at this point, it's much too early to make that kind of guess.
Barry, there has been speculation in the last month, drawing from statements by President Reagan, statements attributed at least to Andropov, that things have gotten a little better, or that there's at least the potential for improvement. Is that a real feeling at the State Department?
Well, I think serious people who look at the U.S.-Soviet relationship have to wonder about the way things have been going and have to be concerned and want to change that direction. And to the extent that both Mr. Reagan and Mr. Andropov appeared to make some kind of conciliatory statements over the last month, I suppose that's a positive sign. There was the serious question, however, as to how serious either of they were and whether or not they were simply playing to their respective galleries. Once again, I think we have to wait and see who we have in that position and see how the relationship evolves.
Barry Dunsmore and Bob Zelnick, thank you for joining us for these special reports. Let's look briefly now at the other news this morning. American residents of Beirut are evacuating. Embassy workers and their families ordered to leave. The ambassador and the top staff, of course, remain. Navy and Marine helicopters are evacuating Americans to ships bound for Cyprus. The evacuation comes as Israeli warplanes bombed Palestinian camps near Beirut. The Israelis are targeting military sites and artillery encampments. Above it all, the space shuttle astronauts packed their space bags today for a landing scheduled tomorrow morning back at Cape Canaveral. ABC, of course, will cover live this first Florida landing. Coverage expected to begin about 7:15 in the morning Eastern Time tomorrow morning. And on Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials continued to fall, closing yesterday at 1,152. Stephen Ogg has details in this morning's economic report.
Good morning. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker says stock market reaction to his remarks Wednesday about a recession were overblown. After all, he only used the word recession once, and he told Congress yesterday the economic outlook is generally pretty bright.
Let's go to Washington, where we are joined this morning by an expert in Soviet affairs, Dimitri Simes. Good morning, Mr. Simes.
Good morning.
Of course, our thoughts at this time immediately turn to matters of succession. What can you tell us?
Well, it is quite clear that nobody in the West can be certain who will succeed Mr. Andropov if you are talking about personalities in the Kremlin.
President Reagan has decided against attending the funeral of Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. Some Democrats had urged the president to go to Moscow as a goodwill gesture. But instead, Vice President George Bush has begun a trip that will take him to Great Britain, West Germany, and then on to Moscow for the Andropov funeral. Bush will head the American delegation at the funeral. It is Tuesday. Politburo member Konstantin Chernenko has been named as head of the committee organizing funeral arrangements. And that has led to speculation that he is now the leading contender to fill the Andropov job. The Soviet Central Committee has indicated that a change in the Soviet leadership will not mean a change in policy toward the United States.
Cape Canaveral, the shuttle, as Ralph mentioned, is over the Gulf of Mexico. This will be a first ever landing in Florida for the shuttle. The deorbit burn took place about 47, 48 minutes ago. Mike, at what stage in the landing are we in now?
Well, we're about 10 minutes to touchdown, and we should be, well, there you see a good picture. This is from the control center in Houston.
About 200 miles off the coast of Florida.
The red line is the path the shuttle will take. The yellow